They had been told Americans were monsters who would show no mercy. For 3 years, imperial propaganda painted vivid pictures of brutality awaiting any Japanese who fell into enemy hands. On Saipan, July 9, 1944, as American forces secured the island, hundreds of Japanese women and children huddled in caves, some clutching cyanide capsules, preparing for death rather than capture. But what happened next would shatter every assumption they held. The morning of July 9, 1944, arrived on Saipan with the acrid smell of cordite still hanging in the humid Pacific air. At 05:47 hours, as the sun broke over the volcanic ridges, Captain James Sullivan from Worcester, Massachusetts, led his Marine platoon toward the northern cliffs where intelligence reported civilian concentrations. The 34-year-old former high school teacher had witnessed the horror at Marpy Point 2 days earlier. Hundreds of Japanese civilians leaping to their deaths rather than face capture. The sound of mothers throwing children from cliffs before jumping themselves still echoed in his nightmares. Sullivan's orders were clear but unprecedented: secure the caves, protect the civilians, and demonstrate that American forces operated under principles foreign to this theater of war. The strategic situation had created this impossible crisis. For 3 years, Tokyo's propaganda machine had manufactured a mythology of American savagery. Radio broadcasts described Marines as demons who tortured prisoners, violated women, and murdered children. Pamphlets distributed throughout Japanese-controlled territories showed fabricated atrocities. This psychological warfare served dual purposes. It stiffened military resistance by convincing soldiers surrender meant torture, and it weaponized the civilian population by making them choose suicide over capture. The Imperial High Command calculated that mass civilian deaths would slow American advances and drain resources. By July 1944, this doctrine had produced catastrophic results. On Saipan alone, over 8,000 civilians had already died, not from combat, but from suicide induced by propaganda-manufactured terror. The human cost was quantifiable and devastating. Marine Corps reports documented finding 943 civilian bodies at the base of Marpy Point on July 8th alone. Another 1,200 were estimated lost in cave collapses where families detonated grenades rather than emerge. Field hospitals reported treating 127 civilians for self-inflicted wounds, poison attempts, slashed wrists, failed hangings. The 27th Infantry Division's after-action report noted that only 14% of civilians encountered initially accepted surrender. The remaining 86% either fled deeper into caves, attempted suicide, or attacked with improvised weapons hoping for death by combat. The psychological warfare had succeeded so completely that rescuing civilians had become as dangerous as fighting imperial forces. Captain Sullivan embodied the American officers confronting this nightmare. Born to Irish immigrants in Worcester, he taught American history before enlisting after Pearl Harbor. His worldview was shaped by Massachusetts values: the inherent dignity of all persons, the power of education to overcome ignorance, and the belief that showing someone their assumptions were wrong required not argument, but demonstration. He carried in his pack not just ammunition but medical supplies, canned rations, and a Japanese phrase book he'd studied for 6 weeks. His platoon included Sergeant Thomas Yamamoto from Los Angeles, a Nisei whose parents were in Manzanar internment camp while he fought for the country that imprisoned them. Yamamoto's fluency in Japanese made him invaluable, but his presence also represented the moral contradiction Sullivan struggled with. America interned its own Japanese-American citizens while proclaiming to fight for freedom. The operational challenge began with hard intelligence that changed everything. On July 7th, reconnaissance patrols reported a cave complex near Tanapag Harbor, where an estimated 400 to 600 civilians were trapped. Unlike military holdouts, these were predominantly women, children, and elderly. Families of soldiers killed in the battle, workers from the sugarcane plantations, teachers from the Japanese-run schools. Radio intercepts had captured desperate transmissions. A schoolteacher begging for poison capsules to distribute to her students, a mother asking for permission to kill her 3 daughters mercifully before Americans arrived, elderly men requesting grenades to protect family honor. The 2nd Marine Division's Civil Affairs Section, a unit that didn't exist in 1942 but had been created specifically for this problem, estimated they had 48 hours before mass suicide made rescue impossible. The bureaucratic obstacles were immense. Traditional military doctrine had no framework for this situation. The Marine Corps had trained Sullivan to seize territory and eliminate resistance, not conduct psychological operations on terrified civilians who'd been weaponized by propaganda. Initial proposals from Division Command suggested using smoke to flush the caves, then securing civilians by force. Tactics guaranteed to trigger the exact mass suicide they hoped to prevent. Sullivan, supported by Civil Affairs Major Robert Henderson from San Francisco, argued for a radically different approach that violated every tactical manual. Demonstrate through actions, not words, that the propaganda was false. This required time, patience, and accepting significant risk to American forces. Several senior officers considered this naive, even dangerous. Colonel Davies at Division called it social work in a combat zone. The debate consumed 18 hours while civilians in the caves prepared to die. The decision to attempt peaceful extraction came from an unlikely source. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commander of V Amphibious Corps, a man known for aggressive tactics, not humanitarian gestures. But Smith from Seal, Alabama, had received reports from Tarawa and Kwajalein, where similar situations produced civilian death tolls that haunted him. He authorized Sullivan's plan with a 72-hour window and specific guidance. Show them what Americans actually are. We're not fighting the Japanese people, we're fighting their government. Make them understand the difference. This directive represented something unprecedented in the Pacific theater, a recognition that victory required not just military defeat of imperial forces, but psychological victory over imperial propaganda. At 17:30 hours on July 8th, Sullivan received authorization to proceed. His mission: enter the cave complex unarmed, except for medical supplies, establish contact, and convince civilians that surrender meant survival, not death. Failure would mean hundreds more bodies to bury, and the continuation of a suicide pattern that was killing more civilians than combat operations. July 9th, 06:15 hours. Captain Sullivan's boots crunched on volcanic rock as his team approached the cave entrance at Tanapag. The physical environment was hostile. 94-degree heat combining with 87% humidity, the vegetation stripped by artillery, the ground littered with spent shell casings and the detritus of battle. Shredded uniforms, abandoned equipment, bloodstains dried to brown on the coral. The cave mouth was a ragged tier in the limestone cliff, approximately 12 feet high and 20 feet wide, breathing out cooler air that carried the smell of human waste, fear, and kerosene from lamps. Marine positions on the ridgeline above had orders to hold fire unless Sullivan's team came under direct attack. This created the first tactical vulnerability. American forces were deliberately exposing themselves to potential ambush in exchange for demonstrating non-aggressive intent. Every man on Sullivan's team understood they might die to prove a point. The operational challenges began immediately. Sergeant Yamamoto called into the darkness in Japanese, "We are American forces. We bring food and medicine. No one will be harmed. We want to help you." The response was silence, then the sound of movement deeper in the cave, scraping, whispered voices, the distinctive click of a grenade pin being straightened, the preparation sound before pulling. Sullivan ordered his team to place their rifles on the ground, visible to anyone watching from the cave. 8 Marines disarmed themselves 200 yards from enemy-held territory, violating every survival instinct they possessed. Sullivan kept only his .45 pistol in its holster, clearly visible and clearly not drawn. They carried instead crates of sea rations, medical kits, and 5-gallon water containers. The weight was significant. Each man carried 60–80 pounds of supplies instead of ammunition. This inversion of military priorities would define the operation. The psychological obstacles were more daunting than physical ones. Intelligence from captured documents revealed the specific propaganda these civilians had absorbed. They believed Americans would execute all males over age 12, separate children from mothers to send them to re-education camps where they'd be tortured into renouncing the emperor, and systematically rape women before killing them. These weren't vague fears, but specific scenarios reinforced by 3 years of coordinated messaging. Tokyo's propaganda ministry had distributed pamphlets titled The American Beast, with fabricated photographs and testimonies from survivors of American atrocities in the Philippines and China, completely invented but presented with enough detail to seem credible. The civilians in the Tanapag caves believed these accounts with the certainty of religious conviction. Overcoming this required not just proving the propaganda false, but providing an alternative reality so compelling it shattered their worldview. The human obstacles emerged as faces appeared in the darkness. The first was an elderly man, approximately 70 years old, wearing the remnants of a white shirt and dark pants, his face gaunt from malnutrition. He held a farming sickle, not as a weapon, but as a tool to end lives if Americans attempted entry. Behind him, Sullivan could see women in traditional kimono and Western-style dresses, children clinging to mothers, and the hollow-eyed stare of people who had accepted death. The old man's name was Tanaka Hiroaki, a schoolteacher from Garapan who had taught English before the war and now faced his former language students as enemies. Yamamoto conversed with him for 47 minutes, while Sullivan's team remained motionless, exposed, vulnerable. Tanaka's questions revealed the depth of psychological conditioning. Will you kill us quickly? May we pray before execution? Will children suffer? Each question assumed atrocity. Each answer from Yamamoto, no one will be killed. You will receive food, medical care, and protection, was met with disbelief bordering on incomprehension. The environmental conditions worsened as the morning progressed. By 08:30 hours, the temperature had risen to 96 degrees. Sullivan's team had been standing in direct sunlight for over 2 hours, maintaining non-threatening postures, not seeking cover, deliberately exposing themselves to demonstrate they feared no attack because they intended no violence. 3 Marines suffered heat exhaustion. Corpsmen treated them with water from the supplies meant for civilians, a gesture Tanaka observed from the cave. The cave population was in worse condition. Dehydration had killed 2 infants in the past 48 hours. A pregnant woman was in labor without assistance. 13 children showed symptoms of severe dysentery. 4 elderly persons had wounds from the battle that had gone untreated and were now septic. The smell from the cave intensified as the day heated. Human waste, infected wounds, death. Medical necessity was becoming as important as psychological warfare. If Sullivan's team didn't gain entry within hours, disease would accomplish what propaganda intended: mass death. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a woman's voice from deep in the cave, speaking in broken English. "You are teacher, American teacher?" She addressed Sullivan directly, somehow recognizing in his bearing the profession he'd left behind. Her name was Shimizu Keiko, 42 years old, who had attended the University of Hawaii in 1922 and returned to Saipan to teach at the Japanese-run school in Garapan. She had 3 daughters, ages 14, 11, and 7, and had spent the last 2 days preparing to kill them humanely with a knife rather than let them fall into American hands. But Sullivan's patient stance, Yamamoto's calm repetition of assurances, and the deliberate vulnerability of disarmed Marines violated everything propaganda had predicted. Americans were supposed to attack immediately, to storm the cave with flamethrowers and gunfire. Instead, they stood in the sun, offering food, waiting. This contradiction created cognitive dissonance powerful enough to crack the propaganda's hold. At 09:47 hours, Shimizu emerged from the cave, dehydrated, terrified, carrying her youngest daughter. She walked directly to Sullivan and said in English, "Please, water for children. Then I will die." Sullivan handed her his personal canteen and said through Yamamoto, "You will not die. Your children will not die. You have my word as an American officer and as a teacher. We protect children. We don't harm them." The operational momentum shifted. Shimizu drank, gave water to her daughter, and returned to the cave. For 23 minutes, nothing happened while Sullivan's team waited in the brutal heat, wondering if they had miscalculated. Then movement. Shimizu emerged again, this time with her 2 other daughters and 3 other women with children. Then 5 more. Then Tanaka, still carrying his sickle but no longer gripping it as a weapon. Then a flood. Women, children, elderly men. A total of 187 people over the next 90 minutes, emerging from darkness into daylight, into the hands of the enemy they'd been taught to fear above death itself. Marines distributed water, food, medical supplies. Corpsmen began treating wounds without asking questions, without demanding surrender documents, without military formality, just humans helping humans. Navy medical officers, including Lieutenant Sarah Chen from Portland, Oregon, one of the first female Navy medical officers deployed to a combat zone, established a field hospital treating everything from infected wounds to dysentery to malnutrition. The scene violated every propaganda prediction so completely that several civilians wept, not from relief, but from psychological whiplash of discovering that everything they'd been told was a lie. July 11th, 1944, 14:30 hours. At the Marine Corps Civil Affairs compound established at Tanapag, an extraordinary scene unfolded that would have seemed impossible 72 hours earlier. Under canvas tents erected to provide shade from the brutal Pacific sun, 187 Japanese civilians, former enemies who days before prepared for death rather than capture, now sat at improvised tables eating hot meals prepared by Navy cooks. The menu was American military rations adapted for Japanese preferences. Rice, not the gelatinous American style, but proper short grain obtained from captured Japanese supplies, canned vegetables, spam prepared as rice balls, and sweetened condensed milk for children. But the most significant item was breakfast. Eggs, bread, jam, served on July 10th, the morning after rescue. This simple meal became legendary. Shimizu Keiko later testified, "They gave us breakfast. The Emperor's soldiers told us Americans would torture us. Instead, they gave us breakfast." The symbolism was so powerful that within 48 hours, rumors of the breakfast caves spread through Japanese holdout positions across Saipan, creating unprecedented mass surrenders. The intelligence failure on the Imperial side was catastrophic and revealing. Japanese military commanders monitoring the situation from caves in the highlands intercepted American radio traffic describing civilian processing. The reports made no sense within their operational framework. Americans were using medical resources on civilians instead of troops, diverting food supplies to feed former subjects of the Emperor, and establishing school facilities for children instead of internment pens for prisoners. Captain Tanaka Yoshiro, commanding a holdout position with 43 soldiers in the Makunsha area, received these reports with disbelief, bordering on fury. His operational orders stated clearly that civilians would be slaughtered by American forces, creating horror that would demoralize Imperial troops and strengthen resolve. The propaganda wasn't just messaging, it was tactical doctrine. Americans were supposed to commit atrocities because Japanese forces would commit them. The projection was absolute. Discovering Americans operated under completely different principles created command paralysis. The doctrinal confusion multiplied as evidence accumulated. On July 13th, Radio Tokyo broadcast an urgent message warning that American forces were engaged in elaborate deception on Saipan, feeding civilians to extract intelligence, providing medical care to create propaganda footage, treating captives humanely to poison the minds of loyal subjects. The broadcast revealed Imperial Command's inability to accept that Americans simply operated under different ethical principles. When the International Red Cross, still functional despite the war, sent representatives to inspect Saipan's civilian facilities in August 1944, they found conditions that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements by American initiative, not international pressure. Civilians lived in tents with adequate water, sanitation, medical care, and food rations equivalent to U.S. military personnel. Children attended schools taught by Japanese civilians, including Shimizu, under American supervision. The elderly received priority medical treatment. Women were housed separately with female guards. The Navy had deployed 23 female personnel specifically for this purpose, including nurses Sarah Chen and Dorothy Washington from Chicago, whose presence refuted every propaganda claim about American intentions toward women. The human impact was personified in voices that should not have existed according to imperial doctrine. Tanaka Hiroaki, the schoolteacher who had stood at the cave entrance with a sickle prepared to kill to prevent capture, gave a recorded statement to Marine Corps intelligence on July 18th that circulated throughout the Pacific Theater. I believed Americans were devils. I prepared to kill my neighbors to spare them from torture. Instead, they gave us medicine. They protected us. They treated us as human beings. Every word my government told me was a lie. His testimony was amplified by Shimizu's daughters, who appeared in US-produced leaflets dropped over Japanese positions throughout the Marianas. The photograph showed them smiling, healthy, attending school in the American civilian compound. The caption in Japanese read, "These children were told they would die in American hands. Instead, they learned to read English and eat ice cream." The leaflets included a personal message from Shimizu to all mothers hiding in fear. "I prepared to kill my daughters rather than let them be captured. I was told Americans were monsters. I was wrong. My children are safe. Yours can be too." The first major engagement where this psychological shift became tactically significant occurred at Naftan Point on July 16th. A Japanese force of approximately 500 soldiers and 200 civilians occupied fortified positions that would have required massive casualties to reduce through direct assault. Instead, Captain Sullivan, now recognized as the architect of compassionate extraction operations, led a team including Tanaka and Shimizu to the position with loudspeakers. For 6 hours, they broadcast testimonies, played recordings of children singing in the civilian compound, and offered the same terms. Surrender meant survival, medical care, food, protection. The Japanese military commander, Major Saito Hiroshi, rejected surrender but critically allowed civilians to depart. Over the next 48 hours, 178 civilians left Japanese positions and walked toward American lines, with only 2 casualties from Japanese soldiers who fired on them before being restrained by other soldiers experiencing their own crisis of propaganda belief. This represented a fundamental collapse of imperial psychological warfare. Civilians were choosing American protection over loyalty to the emperor, a decision literally unthinkable under the propaganda framework that had dominated for 3 years. The perplexity on the Japanese military side evolved into something resembling psychological crisis. Intercepted communications revealed officers struggling to explain the defection pattern. Some claimed Americans were using drugs to control civilian minds. Others suggested that those who surrendered were Korean forced laborers, not true Japanese subjects. The racism inherent in this excuse revealed broader imperial attitudes. A few, very few, acknowledged something more disturbing to their worldview, that American forces genuinely operated under principles of humanitarian conduct, even toward enemies. This admission appeared in the diary of Lieutenant Ito Saburo, killed in action August 3rd, whose personal journal was recovered by Marines. His entry from July 20th read, "The civilians say Americans feed them, heal them, protect them. Our command says this is propaganda, but 200 people cannot all be lying. What if everything we were told about the enemy is false? What if we are fighting men who are better than we were taught? What do we do with this knowledge now?" This existential crisis, the recognition that the enemy possessed moral authority despite being the enemy, paralyzed Japanese tactical decision-making. By July 30th, civilian surrenders on Saipan exceeded 8,500 compared to fewer than 1,200 military POWs. The civilians were voting with their feet, choosing the monsters over their protectors. This inversion of the propaganda narrative represented a defeat more profound than any battlefield loss. August 15, 1945. The Emperor's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender reached Saipan at 800 hours local time. In the civilian compound at Tanapag, now expanded to house 14,200 Japanese civilians, the largest concentration of non-military Japanese under American control in the Pacific, the reaction was complex and profound. Shimizu Keiko, now serving as primary liaison between American civil affairs and the civilian population, listened to the broadcast with her daughters beside her. She later described the moment. "I felt relief that the war ended, grief that Japan lost, confusion about what came next, but no fear. I had lived under American administration for 13 months. I knew Americans did not kill defeated enemies. Others in Japan might fear surrender, but we on Saipan knew the truth. This knowledge, earned through lived experience contradicting propaganda, represented the operation's ultimate success. The psychological victory over imperial propaganda had created a population of living witnesses whose existence refuted 3 years of manufactured lies. The statistical validation was overwhelming and historically unprecedented. Between July 1944 and August 1945, American forces on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam processed 43,700 Japanese civilians as protected persons under conventions adapted from Geneva Principles. Japan had not signed the Geneva Convention, but the U.S. applied its principles regardless. Mortality rates in American custody were 2.3% compared to estimated 47% mortality for civilians who remained in combat zones or Japanese military control. Children under 10 in American custody showed 97% survival rates despite wartime conditions, malnutrition from Japanese rationing, and disease prevalence. Medical records documented 8,900 treatments for combat wounds, 50,200 for disease, 4,300 for malnutrition, and 1,100 births with 94% infant survival, higher than Japan's domestic rate during the same period. The contrast was damning. Civilians were statistically safer in enemy hands than under their own government's protection. This reality, documented in meticulous records by Marine Corps Civil Affairs, Navy Medical Corps, and Red Cross observers, demolished any remaining credibility of imperial propaganda about American conduct. The individual destinies of key participants revealed the lasting impact. Captain James Sullivan received a Bronze Star in November 1944, not for combat action, but for extraordinary achievement in civilian relations operations that saved thousands of lives and demonstrated American values under combat conditions. The citation was controversial. Some officers felt medals should reward killing enemies, not feeding them. But General Holland Smith personally insisted. Sullivan returned to Worcester in 1946, resumed teaching American history, and never spoke publicly about Saipan until 1982, when Japanese survivors visited Massachusetts to thank him. He died in 1993, age 83, having lived long enough to see Japanese-American friendship he helped build. Sergeant Thomas Yamamoto's service earned him recognition, but could not free his parents from Manzanar until 1945. The bitter irony, that he proved American values by rescuing Japanese civilians while his own family was imprisoned for being Japanese was not lost on him. He later testified before Congress about the internment, arguing that Saipan proved Americans could treat Japanese humanely when they chose to, making the internment camps even more unjustifiable. Lieutenant Sarah Chen and the Navy nurses who cared for civilians became advocates for expanding female military roles, arguing their presence at Saipan had been tactically essential for gaining female civilians' trust. On the Japanese side, Shimizu Keiko became an unexpected bridge between former enemies. She returned to Japan in 1947 with her daughters, all of whom were fluent in English from their time in American schools. She spent the next 40 years teaching and writing about her experience, contributing to works like Voices from the Caves, published in 1987, which documented civilian experiences under American custody. Her testimony was crucial during the 1950s-60s when U.S.-Japan relations were rebuilt. She testified before the Diet in 1962. The Americans who captured us on Saipan showed us what democracy means, not through speeches but through actions. They treated us with dignity when we were powerless. This is the foundation of trust between nations. Tanaka Hiroaki returned to teaching in Kyoto, where he became famous for making students read American history alongside Japanese history, arguing that understanding your former enemy's values prevents future wars. Several of his students became diplomats in Japan's foreign ministry, carrying forward his belief in cross-cultural understanding born from Saipan's experience. The operational legacy extended far beyond individuals. The civil affairs doctrine developed on Saipan, combining humanitarian principles with tactical objectives, became the template for post-war occupation of Japan and Germany. General Douglas MacArthur's administration in occupied Japan from 1945 to 1951 explicitly referenced Saipan as proof that American forces could occupy former enemy territory while winning populations through humane treatment rather than coercion. The U.S. Army Civil Affairs School, established in 1947, used Sullivan's Saipan operation as a primary case study, teaching that psychological victory requires demonstrating values through actions. The breakfast served to terrified civilians on July 10, 1944, became legendary in military doctrine, an example of how simple human gestures can achieve strategic objectives impossible through violence. By 1965, when civil affairs operations in Vietnam struggled with similar propaganda challenges, the Saipan model was referenced as the gold standard of how to win populations by disproving enemy propaganda through consistent humane conduct. The broader historical reckoning came slowly as documents were declassified. In 1978, when researchers accessed complete Marine Corps and Navy records from Saipan, the scope of the operation became clear. American forces had dedicated 12% of logistics capacity, food, medical supplies, personnel, transportation, to civilian protection during active combat operations. This represented a conscious choice to accept higher military costs in exchange for humanitarian objectives. The decision paid strategic dividends. Civilian surrenders on Tinian and Guam accelerated after Saipan refugees spread word of American treatment. The Battle of Okinawa in 1945, while still horrifically costly, saw 40,000 civilian surrenders, a rate impossible without Saipan's precedent, establishing that surrender to Americans meant survival. The lives saved numbered in tens of thousands. But beyond statistics, Saipan represented something profound, the choice to fight a war while refusing to become what your enemy claimed you were. Imperial propaganda said Americans were barbarians. American forces responded by feeding breakfast to people who'd been taught to fear them more than death. The final legacy is written in a garden. In Garapan, Saipan, at the site where Sullivan first convinced civilians to emerge from caves, there now stands the Memorial Garden of Reconciliation, dedicated in 1994 by Japanese and American veterans together. A plaque bears text in English and Japanese. Here, in July 1944, American soldiers showed compassion to Japanese civilians who expected death. Through simple acts of humanity, water, food, medical care, they proved that even in war, human dignity can prevail. This memorial honors both those who chose mercy and those who discovered their enemies could also be their rescuers. Shimizu's youngest daughter, who was 7 when she received water from Captain Sullivan's canteen, attended the dedication at age 57, bringing her own children and grandchildren. She told reporters, "My mother always said the war ended for her the day Americans gave us breakfast instead of bullets. That was the day she understood propaganda dies when confronted with kindness." This is what we remember and what we teach our children to remember, that ordinary people making extraordinary choices to treat others humanely can change history. That breakfast, served amid the wreckage of war by men who chose compassion over convention, saved thousands of lives, but its greater achievement was proving that even in humanity's darkest moments, the choice to be humane remains possible, powerful, and ultimately victorious. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community exploring the untold stories of Yuao, the moments of humanity that defined us as Americans. Drop a comment below. What lesser-known story from the war do you think deserves to be told? Let's keep these voices alive together. New videos every week diving deep into the history that shaped who we are. Thanks for watching, and remember, understanding our past helps us build a better future.